Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. From the San Diego, California headquarters of the Institute for Creation Research, here are ICR scientists and Back to Genesis lecturers, Dr. John D. Morris and Ken Ham.
Not long ago, it was reported in newspapers that scientists had basically created life in a test tube. Some people still believe this, even today.
Actually, this idea that life can come spontaneously from non-life, that's like spontaneous generation, and every student, let alone every scientist, knows that this has been disproved now for decades.
John, I'll never forget when I was studying biology at high school, Chapter 1, the teacher taught me, life does not come from non-life. Spontaneous generation has been disproved. Then we turned over to Chapter 10, and the same teacher taught me life came from non-life because he was teaching about evolution. This seemed to me to be a contradiction then, and still seems so now.
Dr. Gish, our lecturer in this program, has his PhD in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley. He studied all of these supposed scenarios for the origin of life from non-life and can speak to them with authority. Let's see what he has to say.
The subject of the origin of life, of course, is an important subject in this area of evolution and creation. If life evolved, as Darwin claimed, as evolutionists claimed, it had to come from somewhere. So you have to account in an evolutionary scheme for the origin of life. Now, I want to emphasize, first of all, that no theory on the origin of life is a scientific theory. You see, a scientific theory, to be valid, must involve processes, events, or properties which are repeatedly observable. Now, of course, there were no human witnesses to the origin of life. Quite obviously, no one was there to see what happened. That is, there were no humans there to see what happened. And so any theory on the origin of life, whether we're speaking about creation or evolution, cannot, technically speaking, be called a scientific theory. Let's see what two scientists have to say about that. These scientists are both evolutionists, as far as I know, David Green and R.F. Goldberger, in their book, Molecular Insights into the Living Process, which was published in 1967, had this to say. They said, quote, "The macromolecule to cell transition is a jump of fantastic dimensions, which lies beyond the range of testable hypothesis. In this area, all is conjecture. The available facts do not provide a basis for postulating that cells arose on this planet." What did they say? You see, this is speculations. It lies beyond the range of testable hypothesis. For a theory to be scientific, of course, it must be testable, and that's simply not possible here. But, of course, evolutionists will speculate forever concerning their theories on the origin of life. And I found that some of these people have become rather discouraged in recent years. 20, 25, 30 years ago, they were very optimistic. They felt that just within a few years, they would have solved some of these serious problems and would have some, a fairly good idea how life may have originated on this planet. But as time has passed, they have realized that their experiments either lead into a blind alley or just simply irrelevant as far as the origin of life is concerned. And we just found that these people have become more and more discouraged, certainly. And we want to look at some of these aspects of this notion of the origin of life and see whether it really has some scientific substance or not. Now, of course, when we think about theories on the origin of life, the first thing we have to think about is the nature of the primitive earth. That is the hypothetical primitive Earth. Now, of course, nobody was there. We have no record of that, and so we must just speculate, try to speculate on the basis of available evidence. And there's just not much evidence today, supposedly billions of years after the primitive Earth. But the first thing an evolutionist would have to try to imagine as he speculates on the origin of life is the nature of the primitive Earth. What was it like? Were the gases in the atmosphere similar to the ones that we have today? Or were they quite different? What sources of energy available and how much energy was available? What was the temperature on the surface of the Earth at that time? What sort of chemicals were dissolved in the ocean? What was the pH of the ocean? You see, all of these factors would be very important. And you can be sure of one thing, that the evolutionists will imagine or speculate that the primitive Earth was similar to what he must have for life to have evolved on the Earth. Now, after he has constructed his hypothetical primordial Earth, then he must try to imagine how relatively simple compounds formed on the primitive Earth. And we're talking about things like amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. We're talking about sugar and purines and pyrimidines and things like that, which go into the DNA and the RNA and stuff like that. Those are these rather simple building blocks of these complicated chemicals we find in living organisms. Now, after we have imagined how these relatively simple substances have evolved, and they're really not simple, but they're relatively simple, then the evolutionists must try to imagine how these building blocks were combined to form the complex macromolecules. By that we mean the proteins, the DNA, and the RNA. Then after he has tried to imagine how that may have happened, then of course he must imagine how these molecules just floating around at random in the primitive ocean managed to get together and form these complicated systems, these metabolic cycles. There's hundreds of these cycles found inside of a living cell, all marvelously coordinated in time and space. And so he has to imagine how that may have happened, just spontaneously all by itself. Now, after he has imagined how that may have taken place, then he must try to imagine how the first cell came into existence, the first living thing. Now, if this entity was living, that means it has to exist independently. It must have the ability to take in food and to generate its energy. It must be able to produce the protein, the DNA, and the RNA, so important for its existence. It must be able to construct a membrane, and it must be able to reproduce itself. You see, life, of course, would involve reproduction. Things just break up and deteriorate and disperse, and so in order to perpetuate itself, it must have the ability to reproduce. So at the very instant that life exists, it must have this ability to reproduce. And of course, reproduction, even of a bacterium, requires an incredibly complex system. So those are the various stages in which an evolutionist must work his way through, you see, to imagine how that first living cell came into existence. Now, what about the atmosphere? What about conditions on that hypothetical primordial Earth? Well, first of all, let me point out that there was plenty of energy available. That's not a problem. We have all that energy coming from the sun. The problem, of course, would be the nature of that energy. Would it be helpful? Would it be constructive? Or would it be destructive? But it's certainly we have plenty of energy coming from the sun. So that is where the major source of energy would come from. Now, there'd be some energy provided by electrical storms, electrical discharges, and very minor amounts of energy from other sources. So there's plenty of energy. They imagined that the pH of the ocean was around, pH 8 or 9, just a little bit above neutrality. And the energy, that is, the temperature of the Earth was not too much different